There have been many different restorations and re-edits of Metropolis over the years, but that original score has survived. I'm not very learned in the music department, so unfortunately I'm not going to be able to break down the compositions or harmonics of each track. However, music is still, and always has been, one of the most essential elements of film, and obviously being that this is a silent film, it's even more key to the structure of the story. You have to understand that the music in silent movies was integral to the fundamental sequencing of every film that was made in those days. Now films can have a lot more going on in them. There's audible dialogue for one, which is the main way in which the audience follows along with the story. The music is there mainly to tell the audience what they should or should not be feeling in a given scene, but with the silent films there was an utter reliance on the music. The music was the guide for not just the audience but the filmmakers as well, who'd structure the whole story and sequence of the film around the music. The music was the blueprint for the film in those days. Be that as it may, the score is fantastic. I love this score. It's just as grandiose as all the sets, so you have both of those elements complementing each other perfectly. Sometimes it's the most classical music that can get the most emotional awe out of you in films. Sometimes, not all the time. It has to be something substantial like this. Out of all the classical music that was made for those old films, I think I like this score the best. This is the first time I've really been blown away by a score from that era. It's going in my top 10 film scores of the 1920s list on Letterboxd. You can be sure of that, fuckfaces. Again though, watch the film and hear it for yourself. So now I'm going to talk about the themes of the film. So this section's going to be more for the people who've already seen it. So all the normies, piss off. I'll be referring to the 2.5-hour version of this film, by the way. That's the only version I've seen. So in my first Metropolis video, I mentioned that the story was very simplistic. And that is very true, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any interesting ideas at play. This is one of the earliest examples of social commentary done to this extent, with a huge budget, giant sets, thousands of extras. It paved the way for the methods in which sociological studies were tackled in science fiction films, and films in general, of course. Every great science fiction film that you love because of the things it has to say or criticise about society owes itself in some way, shape or form to this film. Films have evolved so much since, however, that it might be hard to see the brilliance and importance of Metropolis without a little context first. You have to appreciate how young cinema was back then to grasp what sort of effect Metropolis would have had on the art form and the world when it first came out. It was an epic vision of the future, but it was mature in what its message was. Your big films back then were mainly made up of light escapism. Most people saw the cinema as nothing more than some light relief until Metropolis and other films started to reshape the landscape. Metropolis was a cautionary tale of a dystopian future that reflected real issues in the world back then, but everything that Metropolis has to say can also be applied to the modern day, and for that it's achieved a timeless status. The film starts by showing the romanticised vision of the future that everyone at the time had in their heads. An enormous city. Technology has evolved to a fantastical degree. There are giant majestic buildings cutting up into the sky, vast highways going in every conceivable direction, some suspended hundreds of feet in the air. There are planes darting around the sky and between the structures, flowing almost in harmony with the cars. The initial statement this film is giving off is the wondrous potential of inventiveness and the glorious feats of human creation. A statement that is ingeniously encapsulated by the aforementioned music and sets. At the heart of this seemingly paradisical city stands the poignantly named Tower of Babel, an instant indication that man's innovation is never too far away from his hubris. You dickhead. As the film unfolds, you see the cost of this magnificence when you, along with the lead character Frida, are exposed to the grey underground city in which all of the industrial workers who operate the enormous and dangerous machines that power the city above live in squalor. Frieda is your typical leading man, brave, handsome and noble. Like many films that have come since, he's a simplistic, basic character designed to be the vessel for the audience as he traverses this strange science fiction landscape. Putting it simply, the film is essentially a critique of capitalism, specifically the disconnect between the upper and working classes. This isn't hard to puzzle out, the themes of this film are very overt, as is the nature of all the older films. That doesn't make it any less profound, however. The way in which this film conveys those themes is the most interesting part. I've already mentioned countless times how great the sets are, but what makes it all even better is how well they propel the ideas the film is portraying, mainly in the contrast between the dazzling city up above and the dreary city below. This film comments on how we all celebrate and romanticise the achievements and breakthroughs in technology, only revelling in the idealistic side of technological progression, without ever busying ourselves with the underlying and much ignored issues it brings to society. The inevitable bitter trade-off. How with every great milestone in technology and engineering comes the foot soldiers in the lower ends of society who end up being the only ones who have to dirty their hands with the hard labour that is required to achieve these feats. The vaster and more commonplace these machines become, the more strenuous the labour, the harsher the burden is put on the everyday worker. It's about the ways in which the higher classes are ignorant to the human cost of their everyday living, the hubris of the inventor to not see the consequences or implications of his discoveries, the dehumanization of the working class, only being seen as disposable cogs in the machine, when in fact they're utterly essential to the sustainment of society. All common statements now, you could even call them cliches, but cliches always stem from truths, and Metropolis was one of the first films to have the balls to speak these truths in such a fashion. And it's in this movie where those ideas are at their most profound, through the provocative score and meticulous orchestration of every shot and action set piece. Though the film does have a fairly gloomy look of the future, it isn't a demonisation of technology. It's not full-on anti-capitalism, it doesn't take any firm political stances. Like all great art, it's just suggestive. It isn't just cynical for its own sake either. In fact, it's very hopeful. These spectacular structures we see throughout the film are still testaments to the power of man's intelligence and imagination. The film only asks that you also acknowledge the darker side of the coin to these wonders, the things that are harder to look at, or even to accept that they're real. It highlights the importance and necessity for the powerful to not mistreat the many, that all these downtrodden workers are essential to the functioning of society, and we should remember that rather than indulging in some misinformed utopia. The film has the opening and closing text. The mediator between the head and the hands must be the heart. The filmmakers were expressing a concern for the growing gap between the powerful and the poor in their own time. No doubt they thought that with the sudden wave of mechanical breakthroughs, there would also come a wider disconnect between the two classes. Man's brain, man's muscle. The two are dependent on each other and must work in unison for the good of society. A sentiment that will never not apply to any society. And that's why you should watch Metropolis, arsehole. At least, that's my opinion. In my opinion. If it's coming out of my mouth, of course it's my fucking opinion. It may seem like I've done nothing but praise the film, but this is because the only flaws that I could think of were too obvious and would have been too trivial to mention. Of course, some of it's dated and some of the footage is rough. The acting's over the top, but so what? It was all theatrical back then. None of these aspects ruin my experience. It's a great movie. It's an essential movie. Watch it. Yeah, but out of 10, what would you give it?